Hi folks, and welcome back to the Advantage Applications channel. My name's Rich, and one of the things that I've found most useful when managing Microsoft Access front-end files on different users' workstations is the ability for that file to be able to check itself for the correct name and the correct location. That uniformity has helped me a lot if I need to troubleshoot, if I want to make sure that users have the most current version of the front end, things like that. It's just always a good idea to make sure everybody's on the same page. And users will definitely sometimes inadvertently copy files. They may delete files altogether. They may end up holding old files in different locations. And so you kind of don't want that because it gets a little sloppy. It could introduce problems with the database. So in this video, what I'm going to show you is how to create an Access front-end file that checks its name and location on startup. And if it isn't in the correct location or doesn't have the correct name, it's going to create a copy of itself, put it in the correct directory, create that directory if necessary, make sure that its name's correct. Then it's going to launch that correct version of the file. Once that file opens, it's going to reach back and delete the file that was in the incorrect location so that you don't have any rogue copies running around out there. Now, this is a bit of an advanced topic. I assume that you probably have some knowledge of VBA before you get started on this. And as always, if you want to become a member of my channel, all of these source files and practice files that I use in these videos are available to my members. Membership is less than the price of a coffee. I'll put the link in the description in case you want to check that out. But anyway, let's get started. This is a database that I've used in other videos on this channel. It's a simple event reporting tool, but all we're interested in for this video is making it self-install. And to do that, I start with a startup form. Now this can be any form you like so long as it is the first form that opens in your database and that the code that runs in it happens before anything else. So as you see here, I go into my File menu, I select Options, then Current Database, and I have FRM Startup set as my display form. Next, I want to write some code in this form's open event. I'm going to set two constants, one to hold the correct name that the database should have, and another to hold the correct path that the file should reside in. Now I need to test to see if the current database is named correctly and in the correct location. And if not, I'm going to write code to make it so. I'll write a subroutine to handle this and I'll call it self-install. I'll pass it the correct name and correct path as arguments. And let's write this in its own code module. And the first thing I always do when working in a code module is to set option explicit. This is to ensure that all variables are explicitly declared and prevents us from accidentally declaring new variables if we make a typo. Next, I create the subroutine signature, including parameters to hold the arguments we pass in. And this routine will be working with and manipulating files and folders. So before we can do that, we need to reference the Microsoft Scripting runtime. To do that, we go up to our Tools menu, then click on References. Now, if we don't see Microsoft Scripting runtime in the checked list at the top, we need to scroll down until we find it. Then put a check in the box beside it, then click OK. I'll put a short comment at the top of this routine to remind myself what it does, and also for any members who download this file. And now I can declare my file system object variable. Now it's time to make sure that the directory we want our file to reside in exists, and if not, to create it. For this, I'll use the dir function and pass it the directory variable. If the result is an empty string, I know the directory doesn't exist and I can create it using the make directory function and passing it the path I want it to create. Now that the destination directory exists, we can copy the current database file into it. I'll set the FSO object variable to a new file system object. Then I'll use the FSO's copy method to copy the file. I pass it the current database's name property, which also contains the path of the currently open database, and the directory where I want it to reside, as well as the name I want it to have in the new location. Now we can check our work so far, but before we do, let's confirm that the directory event report doesn't already exist in my C drive. And it does not. Okay, let's put a stop in the open event of the form, then view it in Form View. Our code launches and it determines that the current database is not in the correct location, so it calls the self-install routine. The directory function test shows that the directory we passed in doesn't already exist, so the make directory code runs, and if we check the result, we see that the new directory has indeed been created. We continue to step through the code, and the file system object is created. And the copy file method is invoked with the current DB and the values of the correct directory and correct name passed in as a concatenated string. Then the file system object is set to nothing to free up that memory. The rest of the code executes without issue, and if we check the results, we now see that the database has been copied to the correct location with the correct name. So now our next step is to actually launch the correct copy of the database and close this one. To do this, we're going to go back into mod self-install, and we're going to run a shell command. I'll pass it the name of the application we're launching. In this case, it's MS Access, of course. Then I'll concatenate a double quote, then the path of the file we want to open, as well as the file name. Now we just need one more double quote, and for focus I'll choose VB maximized since I want the newly opened file to be displayed on top of any other open applications, so the user sees what they expect to see, which is the database they are launching. Now to test this, I'm going to delete the event report folder from my C drive so that we test the complete self-installation as we have it so far. Now I'm going to relaunch our startup form by selecting Form View. This will execute the code just as if we were opening the database. And everything happens quickly, and we see the Enable Content button at the top of the screen, which is our first indicator that it worked. But we'll confirm by going to the C drive, and there is our event report folder correctly recreated, and we are running the newly copied and renamed Access database. And we know that for sure because of the presence of the laccdb file. The last thing we need to do now is to make it so when the database launches, it deletes the rogue copy of the database that needed to be copied into the correct location. To do this, we're going to need to create a new table to hold the path and name of the rogue copy of the database. We only need one field. I'll call it full path, and we'll call the table TBL rogue copy. We'll need to populate this field at the point in our code when it's determined that the current database either isn't named correctly or isn't in the right location. And that happens here in the open event of FRM startup. So just inside this condition, before we call self-install, is where it needs to go. I'm going to use an insert statement to write this data to the table, so I'll want to dimension a string variable to hold my SQL. Now I'll create my insert statement. And if you aren't familiar with using SQL inside of VBA, you can check out my video where I'll walk you through that. I'll put a link in the description. Now I'll just turn off warnings, execute the SQL statement, and turn warnings back on. And again, what this is doing is saying, okay, the current database is not named correctly, or it's not in the correct location. So we're going to make a copy of it, name it correctly, and put it in the right location. But that new copy is going to need to be able to delete this rogue copy once it launches. So if this conditional statement determines that the database is named correctly and in the right location, it needs to delete any rogue copies in TBL rogue copy. And if you're confused by the flow of this code, don't worry, it'll be clear when we step through the execution of the application in just a minute. I'm going to put an else clause on this if statement. And in here I'll write code to delete any rogue databases that are listed in TBL rogue copy. And even though there should only ever be one record in this table at any given time, I'm going to write the code so that it can handle multiple records just in case. I'm going to dimension a record set object. Then I'm going to set it to all the records in TBL rogue copy. Then, for as long as there are records in the record set, I'm going to delete the file stored in the full path field. Once that finishes looping, I'll close the record set and set it to nothing. Okay, we should be ready to run this and test it completely. Again, I'll delete the event report folder from my C drive so that we can get a good clean test. And note that I'm launching this database file from C users EJRUI, OneDrive, Documents, Rich, Advantage Applications, YouTube. And now I'll select Form View for our startup form. The code runs. I'll enable content. And now we see that the currently running database is the one in the newly created event report folder in the C drive. There's our LACCDB file to prove it. And if I go back to the folder where we launched our rogue copy from, we see that the file has been deleted. Now there are just a couple things left to do to really make it slick. And the first is to delete all of the records in TBL rogue copy, since we just deleted the file or files that they would point to. That way the table doesn't get bloated and make your code run through records it doesn't need to. And the second thing is, since you'll be the developer of this database and it's likely you'll have one or two copies of the database in folders that aren't the same as what the users will have, you don't want this self-installer firing off every time you launch the database. So we'll write a conditional statement upstream that will only execute the self-install code if the person launching the database isn't you. So that's pretty much it. At that point, you could have your startup form do whatever you really wanted it to do. You could have it close, you could have it launch the dashboard or whatever the main form for the user interface is. What I typically like to do is to keep that form hidden in the background, running on a timer and checking certain things as it goes, like whether or not the version that the current user has is up to date, if there's a new version available, or if I need to boot users out of that database. And in fact, the next video I make is going to be on how to make sure that the users are all in the most current version of your front end. So if you enjoy these videos or find them useful, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and take care.